Hey friends, welcome back to Fantasy Awash. Today I'm going to be talking about, what's this? Today we're going to be talking about Portal Fantasy. Let's jump in. Fantasy is a subgenre of fantasy that involves characters from the real world being transported to a different fictional world. This is sometimes through a magic object, through a doorway. In Portal Fantasy stories, the protagonist usually starts their journey in our world and then ventures on into this fantastical realm of sorts. As I said, it could be through a different object, it could lead them to a parallel universe, an enchanted forest, a whole new world or universe. We don't really know, and often that's why I think we are so pulled in to Portal Fantasy. We want to know what this new world is about. So today what we're going to be talking about is why is it that we seem to be so drawn to Portal Fantasy, be super prevalent, and we might just be so acclimatized to it that we're not really noticing it anymore. And I also then want to look at specific types of Portal Fantasy, being the stories themselves. Are they geared more towards children, adults? Is there a good branch between both of them? And lastly, why is it so many adaptations seem to be of Portal Fantasy? So let's dive in. I think part of the reason that we have grown to love Portal Fantasy so much is that because we are most likely introduced to Portal Fantasy when we are children. A lot of the examples when I was researching Portal Fantasy initially that came up were children's stories and or stories that we believe are for children but aren't necessarily for children, but I'm going to get to that in a minute. I did, however, take to the internet to do research and was wondering if people actually knew the term Portal Fantasy and were familiar with it. I scoured Reddit and I looked at Facebook groups that I was involved in that are fantasy related and sci-fi related, and most people, it seemed to almost be split 50-50, maybe 60-40, leaning towards the fact that yes, they knew that Portal Fantasy, what it was. 40 to 50% did not know what it was. When they were told what it was, were like, oh, okay, yes, I know what Portal Fantasy is. I just didn't understand that that was the subgenre title that has been attributed to it in the last probably couple of years. It might be a booktube terminology that's kind of just taken off. I would say that most of us are exposed to Portal Fantasy most likely when we are children. Some of the best case examples are children's stories. That would be Alice in Wonderland, Alice Through the Looking Glass. We have Peter Pan, which even though it is written as a children's story and it is advertised as a children's book, I don't really feel like Peter Pan is a children's book. I think it is more geared towards adults. It's not to say that children wouldn't find something from that. They definitely would, but the story, I believe, is written more so from the perspective of an adult reader, more so than a child reader. Some better known examples as well are the Chronicles of Narnia. We definitely dive into this with Portal Fantasy. It is probably the classic tale. This was most likely my first exposure to Portal Fantasy. I remember being given the book by a teacher. She told me she thought I would really like it, and I ended up rereading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe about 6 times in the span of a couple of months because yes, she was right. I did absolutely love it. A few other books that could possibly be more geared towards middle grade would be Harry Potter, and we have His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. As we then start to move upwards in our age bracket, I would say that the book Stardust by Neil Gaiman, as well as Neverwhere. There's a lot of Neil Gaiman books that really could be considered Portal Fantasy. We have The Magicians by Lev Grossman. This would be geared more towards adults. We look at specific case-by-case studies for Portal Fantasy and what exactly Portal Fantasy is. If we're looking at some of the examples that I just came up with, in Alice, we have her falling down the rabbit hole and then her drinking potions, eating snacks, going through the door and entering Wonderland. So Wonderland in this case is our alternate world. The portal itself could be considered the rabbit hole, the doorway. It's, kind of all connected, but that would be considered the portal aspect of this. If we're looking at the Chronicles of Narnia, you could literally argue for each book that each book is considered Portal Fantasy. However, because The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is probably the one that people are most familiar with, not everyone has read the entire 7 books. That is the wardrobe. The Pensieves visit an old relative. They're staying with him during the Second World War. It might not even be a relative. It might just be someone that they were sent to because that happened in the Second World War. Lucy Pensieve finds the wardrobe. She pushes the coats aside and she's in Narnia. Narnia is our new world, our new universe, and we come to start learning about all the aspects of this new world. And I think what pulls us into these stories is that Because it is someone from our world, we're starting with lower magic rather than higher magic. And lower magic and low fantasy typically is a story that takes place in our world. However, there are fantastical elements, but it does apply to portal fantasy because the characters originate in our world. Our world might not have magic in the case of the Chronicles of Narnia, in the case of Alice in Wonderland. In the case of Alice in Wonderland, in the case of the Chronicles of Narnia, this is definitely the case. It's once they enter this alternate magical portal world that magic does start seeping into the story. And I think that what makes it so appealing to us as an audience is that we get to experience it the same way that our character would get to experience it, because we are from this world that does not have magic, and therefore it becomes more interesting. At least this is my take, in my opinion. Some specific case-by-case studies for portal magic we have in The Magician's Nephew, C.S. Lewis. The moment of portal fantasy occurs when the protagonists Diggory Kirke and Polly Plummer discover a set of magic rings created by Diggory's uncle, Andrew Ketterley. The rings possess the power to transport the wearer to different worlds. Intrigued, Diggory and Polly decide to try on the rings and find themselves whisked away to the wood between the worlds and a mystical place filled with many pools, each serving as a gateway to a different world. This magical transition marks the pivotal portal fantasy moment in the story as it propels Diggory and Polly into a series of adventures across various enchanting realms, including the newly created world of Narnia. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, we see the moment of portal magic occur after Harry has had the owls deliver his letters of acceptance to Hogwarts. He goes to platform 9 3/4 at King's Cross Station, and as he goes through the wall, that is our portal. So we have these moments where we see our character literally transitioning from realm to realm. An interesting case in this is his Dark Materials, the trilogy by Philip Pullman. The entire series can be considered as a portal fantasy as it features multiple instances of traveling between different parallel worlds. However, a notable moment of portal fantasy occurs when the protagonist Lyra discovers a window to another world in the back of Lord Asriel's study. This window, called an intercision portal, allows her to step into a parallel universe. Lyra then encounters new allies, uncovers important secrets, and embarks on a journey that takes her across various realms and dimensions. The concept of multiple worlds and the ability to move between them is central to the narrative, making his Dark Materials a captivating example of portal fantasy. The Magicians, however, by Liv Grossman, is more considered to be an adult story. The magical portal is located within the physical grounds of a university in the story. More specifically, the portal is hidden in a door located in the basement of a kid's cottage on a campus. So here we have a physical portal, and this is definitely something that is quite common. More often than not, we are going to see physical portals more than anything else. Other notable stories to mention are A Wrinkle in Time, The Never-Ending Story, and Outlander. One of the most interesting books that I've read this year is Pure and Easy by Susanna Clarke, and this too can be considered a portal fantasy. We know that there is a connection between worlds, so even though most of our characters and stories might start in children's fantasy, it definitely can make its way up to adult fantasy. So one of the things I then wanted to look at are what are some long-standing effects on characters that experience portal fantasy, because often we relate to our protagonist and that is why we are so endeared to a story. And I wondered, is there some sort of connection here as to why we enjoy portal fantasy so much? One of the big things is transformation and growth. We see that these characters start off in our world, they're no different than us, and then they go to these new places. They are able to experience these grandiose things. Some involve magic, some involve lesser magic, but they are transformed from this. They grow. It is essentially the hero's journey that was cataloged initially by Joseph Campbell. We see that our characters start out having to go on a journey or quest that they didn't necessarily expect. They go through an arduous task, they come out better for it in the end, and they themselves are transformed. It's similar to the cycle of life in which we grow, we evolve, we change through our challenges, even though we aren't necessarily being transported to portal worlds. The next I noticed was resilience and adaptability. We see that these characters are able to, as I said, undergo quite difficult tasks. Sometimes that is in order to simply get home. It is to reunite with a family member. It is to save someone that they have met in this new world. and all the while they are able to navigate this, adapt new skills, and it therefore makes them quite resilient. Expanded horizons, I thought this was kind of interesting because it was similar to what I think in our modern world would be like traveling, because of the fact that they are able to go and experience these new places. They come back with their horizons broadened. They understand that their world is not the center of the universe, that there could be in fact multiple universes. They just are now open to endless possibilities, and it is able to change their perspective on so many things and broaden their horizons because of this. Loss and longing I thought was a really interesting one. I found that this was particularly the case in the story of Piranesi. I don't want to give away too much of the plot for this, but it is definitely one that, because a character is no longer in their home world or an original world, you can see that sometimes they feel that disconnect, that loss, because they are not always with their family. They are out of their comfort zone, what they're familiar with. So we as humans undergo loss fairly regularly. This is not a foreign concept to us. It could be in the form of us moving and losing our friends because we know that we're not going to keep touch. It could be the loss of a pet, a family member. There's a myriad of different options, but we know what loss is, and we are able to relate to characters on a very human level because of this. I then noted responsibility and purpose, because always our protagonists, when they are entering into a portal world, a different world, a parallel universe, whatever you want to call it, they are usually charged with the task, and it makes them responsible. And I feel like this is just regular life. We can relate to this. It could be a school project, a task at work, parenthood, whatever you want to call it. We know what responsibility looks like. We understand the difficulties of responsibility, of being in charge, of having to get things done orderly, properly, on time, and we can relate to our characters when they are thrust into these situations. And lastly, I want to talk about adaptations for Portal Fantasy, because I do think it's really interesting that if we look at several of the movies and shows that have been adapted over the last probably 20 to 30 years, many of them are rooted in Portal Fantasy. When I reached out to my fantasy groups on Reddit and Facebook to see if they knew what Portal Fantasy was, the ones that said that yes, they definitely saw and understood that more often than not. Shows and films that were being adapted based on books, fantasy books specifically, were most often Portal Fantasy. And it is important, I think, because often a lot of the adaptations initially were made for children. However, I feel like that is starting to evolve and change. The main reason I think that we want Portal Fantasy is escapism. We want to turn on our television, go to the movies, and go to a world that isn't ours, where our problems aren't going to be at the center of the story. And this provides the perfect outlet for that, especially if we're looking at angsty kids and teens. What better than a different universe to let you know that there is other stuff going on. You don't need to focus on your problems. One of the first adaptations I saw growing up was The Never-Ending Story. I didn't realize it as a kid, but yes, it is Portal Fantasy. If we look back to the early 2000s, the Chronicles of Narnia were being remade. This is Portal Fantasy. Stardust that Neil Gaiman wrote. We also have Neverwhere, which was originally made for television. And we have Outlander. And I feel like Outlander is an interesting bridge between genres, because it could be considered historical fiction, it could be considered romance, it could be considered Portal Fantasy, because our protagonist goes, touches a stone, and is transported through time. And it has been wildly successful. So I find it interesting that as time is progressing, more and more adaptations are happening. More of them are becoming Portal Fantasy, and we are starting to see more and more of them become geared not just towards children, but also towards adults. You know, in the comments below if you love Portal Fantasy, if you are kind of tired of Portal Fantasy or sick of it. I'm curious. I love a good Portal Fantasy story. It's probably one of my favorite fantasy genres, honestly. I love discovering a new world and how the characters will manage to survive it, I guess. It's just something that I find really endearing, and I think probably because of that is because of that teacher who handed me The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when I was in the 6th grade. And I think in part, whether or not we love Portal Fantasy or hate Portal Fantasy, we can appreciate what Portal Fantasy has done for the genre of fantasy overall, because it has created many fantasy fans from multiple ages throughout the last few generations. If you'd like to help me, you can hit like and subscribe and keep up with the channel. If you would like to follow me on Instagram to see what I'm reading, you can find me at Fantasy Awash. And as always, I will see you next time.